Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The tenement on Mulberry Street smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool, always. Even in summer, when the heat pressed against the wooden walls like a living thing, that smell persisted, mingling with sweat and chamber pots and the acrid smoke from Mrs. Kowalski's pipe on the third floor. The boy who would later understand the language of ledgers was born into this smell, into a room shared with 5 others, where his father's cough rattled through the nights like dice in a tin cup. Numbers arrived before words, somehow. 3 sisters, 2 flights of stairs, 1 window facing the alley, 4 cents for bread. The boy counted everything, organizing a world that seemed determined to remain chaotic. His father worked at the rope factory down by the East River, where machines ate fingers and lungs with equal indifference. Every evening he returned home grayer, bent a little more, until the winter the boy turned 8, when he did not return at all. An accident, they said. The machinery had been hungry that day. His mother took in washing after that. Her hands, once soft enough to smooth his hair, became red and cracked, perpetually wrinkled from lye soap. She never complained. That was not the way of women who understood that complaint changed nothing, that survival required silence and the steady rhythm of work. The boy learned to deliver the clean laundry, walking through neighborhoods where the houses had glass in every window and doors that closed properly. He noticed how the wealthy kept their accounts written in leather books, how shopkeepers marked purchases with careful notation. Numbers meant something in those places. They meant order, control, the difference between prosperity and the chaos of Mulberry Street. A charity school operated out of the basement of the Presbyterian Church on Worth Street. The boy went there when he could, between errands and the small jobs that brought pennies home. The schoolmaster, a thin man with spectacles that magnified his eyes to an unsettling size, recognized something in the child's attention to arithmetic. While other students fidgeted through multiplication tables, this one leaned forward, hungry for the logic of it. "You have an aptitude," the schoolmaster said one afternoon, the words falling into the boy's life like coins into a beggar's cup. An aptitude. He did not entirely understand what that meant, but he understood opportunity when he heard its distant knock. At 12, his mother used a connection. Her employer's brother knew a man who knew an accountant, and the boy became an apprentice. Mr. Horace Pemberton maintained a small office near the customs house where he managed books for merchants who imported tea and textiles and other goods the boy had never touched. The office smelled of leather and ink and old paper, a perfume so different from Mulberry Street that the boy felt he had crossed into a foreign country. Mr. Pemberton was 70 if he was a day, with hands that trembled slightly when he wrote, but never made an error. He believed in precision the way some men believed in God, absolutely without question, with a fervor that permitted no deviation. "Every entry must balance," he told his apprentice on the first day. "Assets equal liabilities plus capital. This is not philosophy. This is truth." The boy learned to prepare quills, to mix ink to the proper consistency, to rule ledger pages with lines straight as prayer. He learned that debits lived on the left, credits on the right, and that between them lay the entire story of a business's soul. Mr. Pemberton taught him double-entry bookkeeping, the elegant system where every transaction touched two accounts, where nothing could hide because everything had its mirror. For 5 years the boy, no longer quite a boy, absorbed this discipline. He worked from dawn until the light failed, copying figures in his careful hand, learning to see patterns in columns of numbers the way others might see pictures in clouds. His sister Mary, now working in a textile mill, teased him about his ink-stained fingers, his hunched shoulders, the way he muttered sums in his sleep. Another apprentice worked there too, a young man named Thomas, with quick hands and quicker tongue, who knew all the taverns and could talk his way past any door. Thomas taught him things Mr. Pemberton never mentioned: which merchants cheated their partners, which clerks accepted bribes, how the whole machinery of commerce rested on agreements as fragile as wet paper. "You trust the numbers too much," Thomas said once, grinning. "Numbers lie same as people, if you know how to make them." But that seemed wrong somehow. Numbers themselves could not lie. Only the men who recorded them could do that. Once, in his 4th year of apprenticeship, he noticed a discrepancy in one of Mr. Pemberton's client accounts. A shipment of silk recorded at 2 different weights in 2 different books. The difference was small, barely 20 pounds, but it nagged at him, the way a loose tooth nags at the tongue. "Mr. Pemberton, sir, I believe there may be an error in the Dutton account." The old man's eyes, magnified behind his spectacles, fixed on him with sudden, cold intensity. "You believe?" "The August shipment, sir. The manifest shows—" "I know what the manifest shows. I recorded it myself. Do you presume to correct my work?" The apprentice felt his face burn. "No, sir, I only thought—" "Thinking is not your duty. Accuracy is your duty. Copy the figures as they appear. Ask no questions about matters beyond your understanding." He had copied the figures. He had asked no more questions. But the discrepancies stayed with him, a small seed of doubt planted in soil where nothing should grow except certainty. Mr. Pemberton died the winter the apprentice turned 17, quietly in his sleep, which was a mercy. The old man had trained him well, had given him a trade worth more than gold in a city that ran on commerce and credit. At the funeral, the few merchants who attended looked at the young man with appraising eyes, calculating his value, weighing whether he had absorbed enough of his master's precision to be useful. He returned to the tenement that night, walking through streets where gas lamps were replacing oil, where the city pushed upward and outward like something alive. His mother sat by the window, sewing by candlelight, because gas cost too much for their rooms. "Mr. Pemberton left me his tools," he told her. "His pens, his ledgers, his ruler." He left me his reputation." She looked up, her eyes tired but pleased. "That's worth more than money." Perhaps it was. He had climbed out of the chaos through numbers and discipline. He had an aptitude. He had a trade. The smell of cabbage and damp wool still clung to his clothes, but in his hands he carried something else. The promise that order could be imposed on disorder, that careful attention might build a different life than the one he had been born into. The winter cold pressed against the window glass. Somewhere in the vast machinery of the city, ledgers were being closed for the day, accounts balanced, truths and lies recorded in permanent ink. He did not yet know that some discrepancies were not errors, that some questions led to dangerous places, that the numbers he trusted were about to teach him things Mr. Pemberton had never mentioned. But that knowledge would come. Everything came in time, in its proper sequence, debits and credits marching toward their inevitable reckoning. The position at Whitmore & Sons arrived through Mrs. Chen, who kept a boarding house on Pearl Street and knew everyone worth knowing in the merchant quarter. Her nephew worked in their counting house, and when Mr. Pemberton's former apprentice appeared at her door with references and ink-stained cuffs, she saw an opportunity for both profit and kindness. "Shipping merchants need reliable men," she said, pouring tea that cost more than he could afford. "They lose thousands to careless bookkeeping. You will be careful, yes?" He would be careful. Careful was all he knew how to be. Whitmore & Sons occupied 3 floors near South Street, where the masts of clipper ships rose above the rooftops like a forest of dead trees. They imported coffee from Brazil, sugar from Cuba, cotton from Charleston, and a dozen other commodities that flowed through the port in an endless river of commerce. The firm was old, respectable, built by the current Mr. Whitmore's grandfather when the city was still small enough to walk across in an afternoon. The junior clerk's duties began simply enough. He recorded cargo manifests, tracked warehouse inventories, reconciled bills of lading against actual deliveries. The work required precision, but not imagination, which suited him perfectly. Numbers arrived, he processed them. They departed into ledgers where they would live forever in ordered columns. His room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house measured perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small desk beneath the window. Luxury compared to Mulberry Street. He could close a door. He could light a lamp and read without 6 people talking around him. The room cost nearly half his wages, but privacy, he discovered, had a price worth paying. Mary visited on Sundays when the mills closed and she could escape the noise of looms that had already stolen part of her hearing. She was 18 now, quick-tongued and practical, working 12 hours a day for wages that barely covered her own boarding house across town. "You've become quite the gentleman," she teased, touching his new collar. "Mother would be proud." Their mother had died the previous spring, quietly and without complaint, as she had lived. They had buried her in a potter's field because that was what people like them could afford. He kept a small daguerreotype of her in his desk drawer, her face frozen in that peculiar solemnity the camera required. The work at Whitmore & Sons expanded as his competence became evident. Mr. Whitmore, Jr., who managed daily operations while his aging father attended to investments and social obligations, promoted him to senior clerk within 2 years. More responsibility, more wages, more trust. He began keeping personal savings hidden in 3 different locations because trust only extended so far, and he had not forgotten what poverty tasted like. Thomas appeared occasionally at the tavern near the docks where clerks and warehousemen gathered after work. He had grown prosperous somehow, wearing clothes too fine for honest bookkeeping, speaking casually of men who ran the city's political machinery. "There's money to be made for clever fellows," Thomas said one evening, buying rounds he could not previously afford. "The Customs House processes thousands of declarations monthly. Sometimes papers need adjusting. Sometimes blind eyes need purchasing. That's corruption. That's commerce. You think the great merchants built their fortunes through honesty alone?" He did not answer. He had seen enough by then to know that commerce and corruption braided together like rope, but acknowledging it felt like betraying Mr. Pemberton's memory. Margaret worked in a dress shop on Broadway, her fingers as quick with needle and thread as his were with pen and ink. They met when he delivered an account statement to her employer, and she had looked up from her sewing with eyes that assessed him the way he assessed ledgers, carefully, looking for balance. Their courtship proceeded with appropriate caution. Sunday walks through the new park being built uptown. Occasional attendance at lectures on improving topics. Careful conversations about futures that might be built through steady work and modest ambition. She had no family in the city, having come from a village in Pennsylvania after her parents died, and this orphanhood created a kinship between them deeper than romance. They married in a simple ceremony at City Hall when he turned 23. The celebration consisted of dinner at a respectable restaurant where the white tablecloths represented a kind of achievement neither had imagined in childhood. Mary attended, and Mrs. Chen, and a few colleagues from Whitmore and Sons. Thomas sent a gift, but did not come. The apartment they rented occupied 2 rooms above a bakery where the smell of bread rising before dawn became their morning alarm. Margaret kept the place spotless, made curtains from fabric remnants, and budgeted their combined income with a precision that matched his own. She dreamed of a proper house someday, in a neighborhood where Irish and German immigrants gave way to American-born families climbing toward respectability. "We'll have it," he promised, "if we're careful." Always careful, always counting, always aware that the gulf between modest security and Mulberry Street poverty could be crossed in either direction. His work at Whitmore and Sons took him deeper into the firm's operations. He reviewed cargo manifests, insurance policies, warehouse receipts, customs declarations, mountains of paper documenting the transformation of goods into money, money into more goods, the endless cycle that built fortunes and cities. Sometimes, late in the evening, when others had departed, he examined old ledgers out of curiosity, or perhaps professional compulsion. The firm's records went back decades, thousands of transactions recorded in different hands, the history of American commerce written in debits and credits. One winter evening, reviewing insurance claims against actual deliveries, he noticed something peculiar. A shipment of gold bars from California, received at the warehouse, recorded at one weight on the manifest, but a slightly different weight on the insurance documentation. The difference amounted to perhaps 3 bars, worth several $100s. He checked the corresponding ledger entries. Everything balanced. The numbers worked. Yet, somewhere between the ship and the warehouse and the final accounting, gold had disappeared or been recorded incorrectly. He mentioned it to the warehouse foreman, a Dutchman everyone called Dutch Henry, who shrugged with elaborate unconcern. "Scales differ. Weights shift during transport. You worry too much about small things. But gold did not shift. Gold was gold, immutable and precise, the one commodity whose value never changed. He found two more similar discrepancies over the following months, always involving gold, always small amounts, always accompanied by initials he did not recognize. J.R.H. The initials appeared in margins, in notation that seemed almost like code, connecting transactions across different ledgers. Margaret noticed his distraction. "You've been staring at those papers for an hour without writing anything, just verifying some figures. Your figures are always correct. Come to bed." He went to bed, but the numbers followed him into sleep, arranging themselves into patterns that suggested questions he did not want to ask. Small amounts, yes. Perhaps errors, as Dutch Henry suggested. Perhaps scales that differed. Perhaps nothing at all. Yet Mr. Pemberton's voice echoed across the years. Every entry must balance. And these entries balanced only if you did not look too closely. Only if you accepted that numbers sometimes lied, despite his old master's insistence that they could not. Outside, the city continued its relentless expansion. Gas lamps multiplied. Horse cars ran on rails up Broadway. Buildings climbed higher, reaching toward a sky that seemed to recede as ambition pushed upward. He had climbed too, in his modest way, out of tenements into boarding houses, into a small apartment with a wife who dreamed of better things. The price of that climb was vigilance, caution, the understanding that security could vanish as quickly as gold recorded at the wrong weight. He would be careful. He would not ask dangerous questions. He would copy the figures as they appeared and trust that someone else maintained the accuracy he had been trained to worship. But the initials J.R.H. haunted him now, appearing in his mind's eye when he closed the ledgers, a mystery he told himself he did not need to solve. The house on Elizabeth Street represented everything they had worked toward. 3 rooms on the ground floor of a respectable building, with proper windows that opened onto a small courtyard where a struggling tree provided the illusion of country living. Margaret hung lace curtains she had sewn herself, and the furniture they accumulated, piece by careful piece, spoke of permanence, of arrival, of distance traveled from their separate beginnings. Their daughter arrived in the spring, small and red-faced and terrifyingly fragile. They named her Anna, and for weeks Margaret's sister Abigail stayed with them, helping with the mysteries of motherhood, while he walked to work each morning in a fog of sleeplessness and wonder. Fatherhood changed the mathematics of existence. Every decision now calculated against a future that extended beyond his own life. Every risk weighed against the tiny person who depended on choices she could not influence. Mr. Whitmore Sr. had died the previous year, leaving the firm entirely to his son, who possessed his father's ambition but not his caution. The younger Whitmore expanded operations, added new shipping routes, partnered with firms in Boston and Philadelphia. Growth meant opportunity for those who demonstrated value, and the former apprentice had become head bookkeeper, responsible for all the firm's accounts, supervising 3 junior clerks who copied and calculated under his direction. The position brought increased wages and increased awareness. He now saw the firm's complete financial picture, every transaction flowing through ledgers he maintained. The work demanded long hours, often extending past dinner, Margaret bringing him cold supper to eat at his desk while he reconciled accounts that grew more complex with each expansion. One evening, conducting a routine inventory reconciliation, he pulled ledgers from 5 years previous to verify a long-term contract. The warehouse records lay open beside the account books, and as he cross-referenced entries, that old unease returned like a chilled draft through an unseen crack. Gold shipments. Always gold. Small discrepancies that individually meant little, but collectively formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. He began pulling other ledgers, tracing back through years of records, and the pattern sharpened into something undeniable. Over 5 years, perhaps 6, gold arriving in New York through various merchants, not just Whitmore and Sons, had been recorded at different weights in different documents. Manifests showed one amount, insurance policies another, final warehouse tallies something else entirely. The differences were never large, rarely more than a few bars per shipment, but they were consistent, methodical, and always marked with those initials, J.R.H. He sat back, his hands trembling slightly. This was not error. This was design. The calculation came automatically. Dozens of shipments, perhaps 100 bars over the years. At current prices, thousands of dollars in gold simply vanishing into the space between one ledger and another, between one set of books and another, erased by the stroke of a pen and the complicity of men who controlled the paperwork. That night he told Margaret, speaking carefully while Anna slept in the next room, "There's an irregularity at the firm, in the accounts." She looked up from her sewing, her face sharpening with the particular intelligence that had drawn him to her. "What kind of irregularity?" "The kind that suggests theft. A great deal of money, over a long period." "Whose theft?" "I don't know yet, but the records show—" "Don't!" Her voice cut through his explanation. "Don't tell me details. Don't investigate. Men who steal large amounts are dangerous men. I'm the head bookkeeper. I'm responsible for—" "You're responsible for our daughter, for this house, for staying alive." She set down her sewing with deliberate care. "Whatever you found, forget it. Copy the figures as they appear and ask no questions." Mr. Pemberton's words, spoken by his wife. But he had been young then, ignorant, content to accept authority. He was not young anymore. Over the following weeks, he made discreet inquiries. The warehouse foreman, Dutch Henry, had left the firm's employment 2 years earlier, abruptly and without explanation. The new foreman, a tight-lipped man named Corcoran, answered questions with the minimum words necessary and volunteered nothing. He approached the firm's insurance agent during a routine meeting. "Do your inspectors ever find discrepancies between manifests and actual cargo?" The agent's smile did not reach his eyes. "Scales vary, weights shift. We trust the firms we insure to maintain accurate records. But if there were consistent errors—" "There are no errors in your firm's records. I've reviewed them personally. Everything balances perfectly." Everything balanced because someone had made it balance, adjusting figures across multiple ledgers to hide what should have been obvious. The sophistication required, suggested experience, access, and protection from men powerful enough to operate without fear of discovery. He began making copies during late evenings, transcribing entries into a personal notebook he kept hidden. The evidence accumulated slowly: dates, weights, initials. The pattern of theft stretched across years. He was not certain what he would do with this information, only that ignorance had become impossible. The note arrived at the firm, delivered by a street boy who vanished before anyone could question him. Plain paper, anonymous script. Careful men live longer. Margaret saw his face when he returned home that evening. "What happened?" "Nothing." But his hands shook as he held Anna, feeling her small heart beating against his chest, understanding with sudden clarity that knowledge carried weight, that seeing truths others wished hidden transformed safety into vulnerability. Mary visited on Sunday with her new husband, a factory foreman named Patrick, who spoke with enthusiasm about labor organizing and workers' rights. They seemed impossibly young, impossibly confident that justice could be demanded rather than begged for. He listened to their optimism and said nothing about the note, about the pattern of theft he could not unsee, about the calculations that now ran constantly through his mind. Thomas appeared at a tavern near the docks, as if summoned by thoughts alone. He had grown heavier, prosperous, wearing rings that caught the lamplight. "I hear you've been asking questions about shipment records," Thomas said, settling onto the bench beside him. "Who told you that?" "People talk." The docks are a small world, despite appearances. Thomas ordered whiskey, expensive kind. "Some questions have answers you won't like. Some doors open onto rooms you can't leave." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm reminding you. Remember when you found that discrepancy in old Pemberton's ledgers? Remember how angry he became? Some men don't like their work examined too closely." "Some men are thieves." Thomas laughed, but the sound carried no warmth. "Everyone's a thief in this city. The only question is scale and who protects you. You've built a good life. Don't sacrifice it for principles that won't feed your daughter." After Thomas left, he sat alone, watching ships unload cargo that would flow through warehouses and ledgers and eventually into the commerce that built fortunes. Somewhere in that flow, gold disappeared, transformed into wealth for men whose names appeared only as initials, whose power extended into firms and insurance companies, and probably customs houses. He thought of Mr. Pemberton, of the old man's fury at having his accuracy questioned. Had Pemberton known? Had he been part of it? Or had he simply understood, as Margaret understood, as Thomas understood, that survival required selective blindness? Anna laughed in her sleep sometimes, small sounds of infant joy untouched by knowledge of the world's corruption. He wanted her to grow up in a city where numbers told truth, where careful work led to honest reward, where men could not simply steal because they possessed power. But wanting and having were different ledgers, and they rarely balanced. He continued his copying, working later into evenings, documenting theft he could not report without risking everything he had built. The initials JRH appeared again and again, a signature hidden in plain sight, marking transactions that flowed through multiple merchant houses, suggesting a conspiracy far larger than one firm's bookkeeping. Winter arrived early that year. Gas lamps fought against darkness that seemed to deepen despite their multiplication. He walked home through streets where wealth and poverty existed side by side, where stolen gold probably financed the very buildings rising around him, monuments to theft recorded in permanent ink. The sun arrived during a summer when cholera rumors swept through the immigrant wards, and mothers kept children indoors despite the heat. They named him James after no one in particular, simply because Margaret liked the sound of it. The birth was harder than Anna's had been, and Dr. Hartwell warned them against having more children, speaking in the careful euphemisms physicians used when discussing women's bodies. James cried often, his lungs strong but his digestion weak, and the sleepless nights returned with a vengeance. The head bookkeeper walked to work each morning with eyes that burned and a mind that refused to stop calculating, even in exhaustion. 2 children now. 2 futures dependent on decisions made in the present. Mr. Whitmore, Jr. called him into the private office on a Tuesday morning, gesturing toward a leather chair that still smelled new. "Your work has been exemplary. The firm has grown significantly, and much of that growth rests on accurate accounting." Whitmore poured brandy despite the early hour. "I'm increasing your salary by 1/3. You've earned it." The amount was generous, more than generous. It would allow them to move to a better neighborhood, to hire a girl to help Margaret with the children, to save toward Anna's eventual education. It was also, unmistakably, a bribe. "Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for your confidence." Whitmore smiled, but his eyes remained flat. "Confidence is earned through loyalty as much as competence. I trust you understand that." He understood perfectly. The raise was not reward, but purchase, an investment in silence, a payment for looking at ledgers without seeing what they contained. Dutch Henry's replacement, Corcoran, had brought changes to the warehouse operations. New procedures, tighter controls, fewer opportunities for casual observation. The man moved like a predator, all economy and purpose, and the dock workers gave him wide berth. Once, passing through the warehouse on an errand, the head bookkeeper caught Corcoran watching him with an expression that communicated nothing and everything. The copies he had made remained hidden in 3 locations. One set sewn into the lining of an old coat in the back of his wardrobe. Another deposited with a lawyer he had never met through a complicated arrangement involving Mary's husband. A third buried in a tin box beneath a loose floorboard in the building's cellar. The paranoia embarrassed him, but the unsigned note had made paranoia necessary. He continued his secret documentation, working by lamplight after his clerks departed, transcribing entries that revealed a scheme of remarkable sophistication. Gold arrived from California and Mexico, processed through legitimate merchants, recorded at one weight initially, but adjusted through subsequent paperwork. The laundered metal then flowed to refineries and banks, transformed into credit that financed railroads, real estate speculation, political campaigns. The initials JRH, through patient research and careful conversation, resolved into a name: James Rutherford Hawthorne. A banker. A man whose portrait appeared in newspapers, whose mansion uptown represented success so complete it seemed almost mythological. Hawthorne sat on boards, advised politicians, shaped the city's growth through strategic deployment of capital that, the bookkeeper now understood, had been stolen bar by bar over years. Margaret found him one night, staring at his notebook, and her face went pale. "You're still investigating?" "I'm documenting." "For what purpose?" "What do you imagine you'll do with this information?" "I don't know yet." She sat down heavily, their son sleeping against her shoulder. "Men like that don't face justice. They are justice. They own the police, the courts, probably half the politicians in the city. If you threaten them—" "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply keeping accurate records." "Records are threats. Knowledge is a threat." Her voice broke slightly. "I cannot raise these children alone." The argument ended there, as such arguments always did, with fear winning over principle, because fear had children to protect, while principle had only abstract notions of righteousness. Thomas reappeared at irregular intervals, always with the air of a man delivering messages he claimed were friendly warnings. The Tammany machine had rewarded him with a position in the customs house, where fortunes could be made through strategic blindness to false declarations and creative interpretation of tariff regulations. "You are always too honest," Thomas said during one encounter. "Honesty is a luxury poor boys can't afford." "We're not poor anymore." "No, but we remember it. That memory should make us practical." Thomas leaned closer, his breath carrying the sweet rot of expensive cigars. "Whatever you think you know, you're wrong. Whatever you think you can prove, you can't. Whatever you imagine you'll accomplish, you won't. Let it go." But letting go required a kind of forgetting he could not achieve. The numbers were there, undeniable, a pattern of theft that violated everything Mr. Pemberton had taught him about the sacred nature of accurate accounts. Every evening he returned home to children who trusted him completely, to a wife who feared his integrity more than his corruption, to a life built on modest wages honestly earned. The police captain who patrolled their ward, Sullivan, began nodding to him on the street with a familiarity that felt like surveillance. Once, Sullivan stopped him outside the bakery. "Your family well?" "Yes, thank you." "Fine children you have. The girl's getting tall. School age soon, I'd imagine." The message beneath the pleasantry was clear as ink on paper. "Your daughter walks to school. Remember that." He told Margaret nothing about this encounter, but that night he held Anna longer than usual, breathing in the soap smell of her hair, memorizing the weight of her in his arms. She had begun asking questions about his work, fascinated by the idea that numbers could tell stories. "What do you count, Papa?" "Everything. Ships and cargo and money that moves from one place to another." "Why does it move?" "Because people want things, and other people provide those things. And I make sure everyone is honest about what they give and take." Margaret, listening from the doorway, said nothing, but her expression spoke volumes about the difference between what he told his daughter and what he knew to be true. Winter brought the draft riots into memory, though they had occurred years earlier. People still spoke of those days when the city had burned, when fury over conscription had exploded into violence that killed hundreds and revealed the fragility of order. He had been younger then, newly married, and the terror had been immediate and physical. This terror was different, slower, more insidious, the knowledge that powerful men had marked him as a problem requiring solution. Mary's husband Patrick had been injured in a factory accident, his arm crushed by machinery that should have been maintained better. The family struggled, and the head bookkeeper sent money when he could, aware that his increased salary came from men who probably owned the factory where Patrick had been maimed, that the whole system fed on itself like some great serpent consuming its tail. Abigail, Margaret's sister, wrote, offering them refuge in Connecticut if they wanted to leave the city. The letter sat on their table for weeks, a standing invitation to flee, to choose safety over whatever stubborn principle kept him documenting theft he could not report. "We could go," Margaret said one evening. "Start fresh, somewhere smaller. You could find bookkeeping work anywhere." "And abandon everything we've built?" "We've built a target. That's what we've built." She was crying now, quietly, the way she did everything, without drama. "I don't want our children to lose their father. I don't want to be alone again." He held her, promising nothing, because promises seemed like lies when delivered by a man who kept hidden notebooks and made copies of evidence that implicated some of the city's most powerful figures. The scheme involved hundreds of thousands in gold over more than a decade. It had financed growth that benefited thousands while enriching a few dozen conspirators who would kill, he now understood, to protect their investment. James slept poorly, crying through nights, his small body racked by colic that the doctor could not explain. The head bookkeeper walked the floor with his son, pacing their modest rooms, calculating odds that never balanced in his favor. One man with notebooks against an organization with resources and reach. One bookkeeper against bankers and merchants and politicians who treated the city as their private ledger. The mathematics were simple. He could not win. Knowledge without power was just elaborate suicide, a slow march toward consequences he could document, but not prevent. Yet he continued copying, continued accumulating evidence that grew more damning with each entry. Some compulsion stronger than self-preservation drove him forward. Some belief inherited from old Pemberton that accounts must balance, that theft recorded was theft that eventually faced reckoning. Outside, the city built itself higher. Gas lamps multiplied. Wealth concentrated in neighborhoods where men like Hawthorne lived behind iron gates, protected by their own private police and the public corruption they had purchased. The distance between Elizabeth Street and those mansions could be measured in blocks, but felt like continents. Unbridgeable gaps between those who maintained ledgers and those who owned the entries within them. Anna had grown tall enough to help her mother with small tasks, fetching thread or holding fabric while Margaret pinned hems. She had her father's eyes, sharp and observant, missing nothing. On evenings when he returned late from the office, she would ask him mathematical puzzles, delighting in the challenge of numbers the way he once had. If 3 ships arrive carrying 200 barrels each, but one ship lost 30 barrels in a storm, how many barrels total? 570. She answered without hesitation. He taught her double-entry bookkeeping as a game, showing her how every transaction had 2 sides, how accounts must balance or something had gone wrong. She absorbed it naturally, the way some children absorbed music or languages, and he recognized in her the same aptitude his old schoolmaster had seen in him decades earlier. Margaret watched these lessons with an expression he could not fully read. Pride, certainly, but also something darker. Perhaps the understanding that intelligence without caution was its own kind of danger. James had grown stronger, his early fragility giving way to a robust health that manifested in constant motion and noise. Where Anna contemplated, James acted, a small tornado of energy that exhausted them both. The children balanced each other somehow, her stillness against his motion, her questions against his declarations. The bookkeeper had found an unlikely ally in the tavern near Printing House Square, where journalists gathered after putting newspapers to bed. William Shaw wrote for the Herald, covering shipping news and commercial matters, a cynic who had watched the city's corruption long enough to lose faith in everything except accurate reporting. Their friendship developed slowly, built on shared drinks and careful conversation that revealed nothing directly but suggested everything obliquely. Shaw had the journalist's instinct for hidden stories, the ability to hear what was not said, to see patterns in disparate events. "Someone's been asking questions about gold shipments," Shaw mentioned one evening, studying his whiskey with elaborate casualness. "Questions are dangerous. Truth is dangerous. Questions are just pathways toward it." Shaw looked up, his eyes bloodshot but sharp. If someone had evidence of systematic theft involving prominent men, what would they do with it? They would burn it and forget they ever saw it. Would they? Or would they find someone who could publish it where burning becomes impossible? The conversation ended there, but a door had opened. Over the following months, the bookkeeper provided information in pieces, never enough to implicate himself directly, always careful to speak hypothetically about ledgers he claimed not to possess, and patterns he suggested were merely theoretical. Shaw investigated independently, pulling public records, interviewing dock workers and warehouse clerks, building a parallel case from sources that could not be traced back to any particular bookkeeper at any particular firm. The reporter had his own reasons for pursuing the story, some mixture of professional ambition and genuine outrage at the scale of theft hidden behind respectable facades. Whitmore and Sons underwent reorganization that spring. The senior Whitmore's death had left the firm vulnerable to acquisition, and a consortium of investors purchased controlling interest. The new owners included representatives from 3 other shipping houses, all bound together through complex financial arrangements that the bookkeeper now understood were designed to coordinate and conceal the ongoing laundering operation. His position survived the reorganization, but barely. He was transferred to less sensitive duties, removed from direct oversight of gold shipments and warehouse accounting. The demotion came with vague explanations about efficiency and specialization, but the real message was clear. They had noticed his attention, his questions, his careful documentation. The transfer was a warning. Margaret saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he started at unexpected sounds. "What will you do?" "My work. What else can I do?" "You could accept their terms. Take the salary they're paying you to stay quiet, and actually stay quiet. Is that what you want?" She was quiet for a long time, folding laundry with mechanical precision. "I want you alive. I want our children to have a father. I want a future that doesn't end with police at our door, or worse, at our threshold." She looked at him then, her eyes fierce. "But I also know you. You've been counting since you were a child, organizing chaos into order. This disorder, this theft, it offends something fundamental in you. I understand that. I just wish I didn't." Shaw published his first article in early autumn, a carefully worded piece about irregularities in gold imports, citing anonymous sources and public records, stopping just short of actionable libel. The article created minor ripples, discussed at dinner tables and in counting houses, then seemingly forgotten as the city moved on to newer scandals. But pressure appeared immediately. Shaw's editor reassigned him to society coverage, writing about balls and engagements and the movements of wealthy families. The reporter fumed but complied, understanding that direct confrontation would end his career entirely. "They own the newspapers too," Shaw said, bitter and unsurprised. "Or they advertise enough that ownership doesn't matter. Either way, the story dies. Not if there's proof, not if it's too substantial to ignore." "You have proof?" The bookkeeper said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. They developed a system. The bookkeeper would leave copies of documents at a certain bench in City Hall Park, concealed in a newspaper. Shaw would collect them on his morning walk, always careful to appear casual, to maintain the fiction that they barely knew each other. The evidence accumulated in Shaw's rooms, hidden in places he never specified. Insurance against the moment when publication might become possible. That moment seemed increasingly distant. The Herald's ownership changed hands, acquired by investors whose interests aligned with those of the men Shaw was investigating. Other newspapers showed no interest in stories that would alienate their primary advertisers and sources. Abigail's letters from Connecticut became more urgent. "Send the children to me. The country air would do them good. They could stay through winter, attend school here, be away from the city's dangers." Margaret wanted to send them. The argument stretched across multiple evenings. Her fear against his pride, her practicality against his stubborn belief that retreat was surrender. "They're watching us now," she said. "You know they are. If something happens to you, if they decide you're too much of a threat, what happens to Anna and James?" "Nothing will happen." "You can't promise that. You have notebooks full of evidence proving you can't promise that." He relented. Anna and James departed for Connecticut on a bright October morning, excited about trains and farms and adventures they were too young to understand as exile. He held them both longer than necessary at the station, breathing in their children's smell, memorizing the weight of them, the sound of their voices, asking when they would return. "Soon," he lied. "Very soon." Patrick's injury had left him unable to work, and Mary's wages from the mill barely covered their rent. The bookkeeper sent money monthly, knowing it came from the inflated salary meant to purchase his silence, finding grim satisfaction in using corruption's proceeds to alleviate suffering caused by the same corrupt system. Thomas appeared one final time, heavier now, prosperous beyond any honest civil servant's means. He settled onto the bench beside the bookkeeper in City Hall Park, the same bench where documents changed hands. "I've been asked to deliver a message." "More of an offer, really." "I'm not interested in offers." $10,000. A position in Albany, away from the city. A fresh start for your family." Thomas spoke carefully, as if reciting memorized text. "All you have to do is stop asking questions and surrender whatever documents you've accumulated." "And if I refuse?" "Then you're refusing men who have resources you can't imagine and patience that's exhausted." Thomas stood, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. "Think about your children. Think about what they'll lose if you insist on playing hero." After Thomas left, the bookkeeper sat alone watching pigeons fight over breadcrumbs, aware that he had been given a final warning disguised as generous terms. $10,000 was enough to live comfortably for years, enough to ensure Anna's education and James's prospects, enough to erase Mulberry Street from memory entirely. It was also the price of complicity, the cost of pretending he had never seen the patterns in the ledgers, never understood how gold disappeared between one set of books and another. The price of agreeing that some theft was too large to prosecute, that some men were too powerful to challenge, that numbers could lie if the right people demanded it. He walked home through streets illuminated by gas lamps that seemed too bright, revealing too much, casting shadows that moved wrong. Mrs. Pemberton, his old master's widow, lived nearby now, in a boarding house that smelled of cabbage and old wood. He visited her occasionally, drawn by nostalgia, or perhaps the need to remember a time when bookkeeping seemed simple, when accuracy was its own reward. "You look troubled," she said, pouring tea that had been steeped too long. "The work has become complicated. Or perhaps you've discovered that it was always complicated, and you're only now seeing clearly." She smiled, her face a map of decades. "Horace knew, you understand. He knew about the discrepancies, about the men who adjusted ledgers to suit their purposes. That's why he became so angry when you questioned him. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right. And righteousness is dangerous for poor men." He never said anything. What could he say? He had children to feed, a wife to support. He chose survival over principle, and I've never decided whether to admire or pity him for that choice. She refilled his cup. "Now you face the same choice. I hope you choose more wisely than he did, whatever that means." The apartment felt empty without the children's noise, Margaret's presence insufficient to fill the space their absence created. They ate quiet dinners, spoke of practical matters, avoided the obvious questions that hung between them like smoke. Winter approached, bringing cold that seeped through walls and windows, reminding him of tenement winters when cold was just another hardship to endure. He had climbed out of that poverty through numbers and discipline, through trust in the sacred accuracy of proper bookkeeping. But that climb had revealed a truth perhaps worse than poverty. The entire system rested on agreed-upon fictions, on numbers manipulated by those with power, on ledgers that balanced only because inconvenient truth had been erased. When winter settled in, it came not with storms, but with the slow, suffocating stillness of ice. The harbor froze in places, and the ships stood trapped like beasts caught mid-stride. He walked each morning through streets muffled by frost, where carts creaked and hooves rang hollow on the stones. And he thought often of Connecticut, of the children breathing country air, while the city held its breath for something unnamed. He no longer worked for Whitmore and Sons. The reorganization had been a mercy or a sentence, depending on perspective. Officially, his position was dissolved due to consolidation. Unofficially, he had been removed for the crime of curiosity. He accepted his severance quietly, carrying away a box of personal effects that included his penknife and inkpot and nothing more. The ledgers remained locked behind doors guarded by silence. Employment proved difficult to secure. Word traveled quickly in the narrow circles of merchants and accountants, and every potential employer seemed to know, before he spoke, that he came with complications. One politely suggested he might try teaching arithmetic to school children. Another, less polite, implied he should consider emigrating. He finally found part-time work as an inventory clerk for a wholesale grocer on Water Street, cataloging barrels of coffee and sacks of sugar. The pay was modest, the atmosphere tolerable, and anonymity proved its own kind of refuge. He spent his days among crates and tally marks, a man reduced to the simplest form of his old discipline. The change felt like sinking into still water, quiet, cold, and endlessly deep. Margaret returned to her sewing, taking commissions from neighbors who could not afford proper dressmakers. She worked steadily, her hands moving even when conversation faltered. The children's letters from Connecticut arrived weekly, full of small triumphs. Anna learning to read faster, James discovering the joy of snowball fights. Their safety justified everything, the hardship, the fear, the lingering shame of failure. Then one morning, as he sorted invoices, a message arrived. Written in a strong but anonymous hand, on paper finer than he could afford, it contained only 2 lines. "Tillman will hear you. Noon, Thursday. Discretion essential." He knew the name. James Tillman, Assistant District Attorney, newly appointed under a reform administration that promised to cleanse the city's corruption. Practical, cautious, known for methodical prosecutions. The letter might have been trap or opportunity. He could no longer distinguish between the two. He met Tillman in a narrow office above Center Street. The prosecutor had the weary eyes of a man who had already seen too much duplicity. He listened without interruption as the bookkeeper outlined, in restrained detail, the pattern of theft. Only when the names emerged, Whitmore, the consortium, Hawthorne, did he raise a hand. "Do you have documentation?" "Some." "Originals?" "No, copies." Tillman leaned back. "That complicates matters, but not fatally, perhaps." He folded his hands. "You understand that without corroboration, accusations against men of such rank will collapse, and quickly. I will need sworn statements, witnesses, tangible evidence. I can find them," the bookkeeper said, though doubt knotted his voice. "You can try," Tillman replied, his tone not unkind, "but find them discreetly. These are powerful adversaries, and they do not forgive curiosity." Leaving the office, he felt the streets tilt under his feet. He had crossed again into danger, drawn by an impulse neither reason nor fear could restrain. Days turned to weeks. The grocer's warehouse became his camouflage, while Tillman quietly pieced together testimony from warehouse laborers, insurance clerks, and dockhands. Several men spoke of Dutch Henry, who had disappeared years earlier with no trace except whispers of a payout. Others remembered Corcoran, whose silence had been purchased, perhaps permanently. Then one night his lodging above the shop was broken into. Nothing was stolen, though drawers were emptied and papers scattered. On his desk, a single coin lay atop a torn invoice, 1 gold piece shining faintly in the lamplight. He understood the message. You count gold, we count you. Margaret received the news of the intrusion with a hollow calm that frightened him more than tears could have. "I will not leave you," she said simply, "but I will not let fear free you from the truth either. Do what you must, but do it fast." The following week, he met Tillman again, in the prosecutor's coach after dark. The case was forming. Discreet inquiries had confirmed much of what he provided. Workers from the docks had spoken, willing to testify in exchange for quiet relocation out of state. Tillman's tone was careful but steady. "We have almost enough. One more witness, perhaps two. Then we move." Hope, after so many months of careful despair, felt almost unbearable. His old friend Shaw reappeared then, thinner, older, still smoking cheap cigars that filled rooms with their stubborn insistence. The dismissed journalist had followed the story from exile on minor papers, keeping his notes safe. "I'm ready to print again," Shaw said. "There's a new editor at the Tribune, eager for reformist glory. If your prosecutor moves, he'll have his proof in print before the ink dries on indictments." It sounded like victory, but felt like exposure. Each new ally meant another potential betrayal, another avenue through which his name might reach the men who still controlled more than half the city's wealth. He slept worse than ever, dreaming of columns of figures that burned like parchment. In March, the letter from Connecticut stopped. Weeks passed before another came, delayed by snow, explaining that the children had fallen ill with fever but were recovering. The relief broke him open. He wept without shame in the small back room of the grocer's office, hiding the tears behind columns of sums that blurred into nonsense. One evening, returning home, he found the door to their rooms ajar. Margaret sat upright at the table, uninjured but pale. A stranger had visited, a man she described as polite, expensively dressed, who inquired about her husband's health and left without waiting for reply. On the chair, a folded note. "Final offer. Tomorrow, midnight. Corner of Reed and Church. Bring the papers. Refusal understood as permanent." He considered going, considered pleading reason or compromise. But Tillman's instructions were clear: provide nothing, appear nowhere. So he burned a candle late, copying his most essential notes once more, creating a final set in case everything else disappeared. He stayed home the next night, waiting. Midnight came, then 1, then 2. No knock, no message. Perhaps bluff, perhaps reprieve. Then, just before dawn, an explosion shook the city's southern ward. The riverfront warehouse, where records from multiple merchant houses were stored, went up in flames. The papers, the manifests, all the proof of years of trade, gone. Fire, the ancient cleaner of evidence. When the news reached him, Tillman cursed softly, then simply said, "We start again." He could not know that many of the men who had approved that destruction would soon panic, fearing exposure, turning on one another in small betrayals that would weaken them more than prosecutors could. He saw only the immediate loss, years of figures, patterns reduced to ash. He worked where he could, cataloging what remained, reconstructing memory into fresh entries. Each evening he returned to Margaret, who waited with calm resignation that had become her armor. "You look ill," she said often, running a hand over his knuckles, now permanently stained with ink. "I'm fine," he answered always. Fine enough, meaning still alive. The spring thaw came late, streets filled with meltwater, and the smell of filth rising anew, the city washing itself but never cleansing fully. Rumors of reform grew louder, elections loomed, the political balance was shifting. Then one morning, at the grocer's office, a messenger arrived. Tillman had requested his presence, urgently. When he reached the courthouse, Shaw was already there, apple-cheeked with excitement, a newspaper folded under his arm. Inside Tillman's cramped chamber lay a transcript, a warehouse worker's sworn affidavit naming Hawthorne and his associates, corroborating the mechanism of theft exactly as the bookkeeper had described years earlier. "It's enough," Tillman said quietly. "Not perfect, but enough to proceed. You'll be called upon soon. Are you prepared to testify?" He hesitated only a moment. "Yes." Then the floor seemed to tilt again, the same vertigo he'd felt when first glimpsing the pattern of stolen gold. The weight of years settled upon him, losses, fears, compromises, and behind them, something small and steady that felt almost like relief. He returned home through streets that no longer seemed to recognize him. The lamplighters were already at work, their poles touching flame to each glass globe in turn, as if the city itself prepared for illumination it could no longer prevent. Margaret was mending by the fire, her face lit from below by orange glow. He told her everything. She did not weep, did not speak, only reached across the table and rested her hand on his ink-stained fingers. For a moment they sat in perfect silence, listening to the faint hum of life beyond their window. The markets closing, carriage wheels on wet cobblestones, the muted persistence of a city that refused both guilt and innocence. He thought of the ledgers buried and hidden, of the figures that balanced now in ways invisible to all but him. The truth remained, surviving even in fragments, waiting its turn in the long arithmetic of justice. By spring, the river unfroze, and the city woke from its long sleep with impatience. Carriages rattled faster, markets filled with new produce, and hawkers' cries returned with a vengeance. Beneath that familiar noise, something vast was shifting. Rumors trailed through counting houses and taverns alike. An investigation, indictments being drafted, names of importance whispered by men who pretended to disbelieve what they feared was true. He still worked for the grocer, but his mornings now began at the courthouse, where Tillman built the case with relentless precision. Ledgers, manifests, sworn statements. It was as if every account he had ever balanced had converged here, forming a single column of truth against the city itself. "You realize," Tillman said one morning, "they'll call you the architect of this affair, the man who uncovered what others profited from hiding." "It's a position both powerful and perilous." "I'm only an accountant," he replied. "No, you're our witness." The grand jury convened in late summer. The heat inside the courthouse felt alive, thick with sweat and anticipation. Merchants gathered outside, pretending casual interest in the proceedings, while messengers ran between rooms carrying folded slips that might shape destinies. When he took the stand, the court clerk instructed him to state his name and occupation. His own voice surprised him by sounding calm. "I'm a bookkeeper by trade," he said, "formerly employed by Whitmore and Sons." He described his duties, the ledgers, the discrepancies, the gradual awareness that ordinary numbers concealed extraordinary theft. As he spoke, he noticed faces shifting, some attentive, some impassive, some hostile. Hawthorne sat among the accused, his immaculate collar gleaming against black cloth. He looked neither angry nor ashamed, only faintly curious, as though observing an insect performing a trick. The prosecutor guided him through the details. Each figure, each weight, each date, moved from past to present in orderly phrasing. When he presented the copies of entries taken years earlier, the courtroom fell silent. Tillman's voice, low and deliberate, broke that silence. "You maintain these records are accurate?" "They are copies of the truth," the bookkeeper answered. "The originals were destroyed by fire, but numbers are stubborn things. They survive in memory." Hawthorne's lawyer rose, bowing slightly before launching into cross-examination. His questions were sardonic, his tone bored. Was it possible the clerk misunderstood the figures? Could weariness have caused transcription errors? Did he have personal grievances against his employer? "None," the witness said. "Only curiosity. And once curiosity found arithmetic, the sum revealed itself." The lawyer's smirk faltered. Shaw, seated among reporters, scribbled furiously. His paper had printed a daring editorial that very morning. "The gold that melted through ledgers." It read like prophecy, though even he could not know how quickly events would follow. When the grand jury adjourned for the day, whispers had become declarations. The city's faith in its mercantile integrity was collapsing under the sheer weight of documentation. Over the following weeks, arrests multiplied. Uniforms appeared in hallways gilded with gilt mirrors, seizing correspondence and account books that, until now, no one imagined vulnerable. Hawthorne fought with the confident arrogance of a man who believed wealth itself could purchase physics, as though money could defy gravity and force reality to rise instead of fall. Yet, even his allies began to abandon him, once they realized the evidence extended beyond rumor. Thomas's name surfaced among minor conspirators. He claimed innocence, which no one believed, and within days a warrant was issued. When the bookkeeper heard of it, a hollow ache spread through him. Not satisfaction, not pity, something midway between. They had once shared bread as apprentices. Now one faced judgment, while the other personified it. The trial opened in mid-autumn, under skies heavy with drizzle. Crowds lined the courthouse steps, drawn by scandal, morality, spectacle. For days, testimony piled like ledgers on a desk, columns of proof, witnesses' oaths, fragments of conversation stitched into a pattern even the defense could not fully refute. Each morning he entered the courtroom through a side door, escorted by officers. Each evening he left by another route, Tillman insisting on precautions. Death threats arrived now with tiresome regularity. Anonymous, identical, using respectable stationery. Margaret burned them unread, though once she handed one to him without speaking. "You have balanced the wrong account," it said. The press began to call him the man of figures. Shaw liked that phrase. "You've become a symbol," he said during one of their brief meetings, "a reckoner for the age of commerce." "I only wrote what was there. That's what makes it frightening," Shaw answered. "They can bribe witnesses, silence rivals, but numbers, they only respond to truth." The trial lasted nearly 2 months. By the end, even those who profited from corruption sensed that some ritual cleansing was required. The verdict, delivered one gray morning, declared Hawthorne guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Sentenced to prison, he received the news without visible emotion, though as the judge finished, the faintest quiver crossed his mouth, whether of anger or disbelief one could not tell. Others fled, taking what wealth they could offshore into the Caribbean or to the new Western territories. Some sold properties overnight, leaving empty mansions behind them like abandoned shells. The city, bruised but alive, adjusted to its new arithmetic. Tillman's star rose swiftly. Reform candidates won elections on the scandal's momentum, promising greater oversight and moral governance. He thanked the bookkeeper privately after the verdict. "You've done the city a service," he said, "though it will never thank you properly." "I did my duty." Most men's notion of duty ends at their front door. Tillman smiled faintly. "Perhaps that's why we needed you." When the newspaper printed its final story, Hawthorne imprisoned, gold scandal laid bare, he read it alone in their kitchen. Margaret was already asleep, the children still in Connecticut, and the lamp flickered against his tired eyes. The article's closing paragraph named him as the witness whose diligence had made conviction possible. It added, almost as an afterthought, that several other firms were being investigated for similar irregularities. The grid of corruption spreading outward in unstoppable pattern, like cracks across frozen water. The noise outside never stopped even that night. Wagons clattered over stones, and newsboys shouted headlines that carried his quiet rebellion to ears that would never know his name before this week. Yet within that noise, he heard something else. Relief, perhaps. The city breathing again after years of stifled dishonesty. He returned to his bed and found Margaret awake, watching him through the dimness. "It's over?" she asked. "The trials, yes. But not the consequences." "No," he admitted. "Those go on." In the following weeks, the price of everything shifted. Gold more stable, shipping stocks trembling, rents dipping slightly only to rise again as confidence returned. People adapt quickly to reformed morality. Profit soon follows where conscience leaves off. Thomas's smaller trial concluded without media attention. He received a reduced sentence, a few years in a distant penitentiary, and vanished from newsprint thereafter. Some said he boarded a train west upon release. Others claimed he was seen in New Orleans under another name. The bookkeeper preferred not to know. Shaw, newly reinstated to prominence, visited once more with manuscript pages in his coat pocket. "A full account of the affair," he said. "Names changed, of course, but truth intact." He tapped the pages. "It won't make us rich, but it might make us remembered. Truth never pays promptly. Better than lies that don't age well." Shaw clasped his hand with genuine warmth. "Take care of yourself, friend. The city forgets quickly, but records endure." When the first snowfall came, he stood at the window and watched the flakes settle over rooftops, softening edges that had seemed unyielding all his life. Anna and James would be returning soon. They had lived half a year without hearing distant carriages or smelling the harbor, without seeing their father's ink-stained hands. Margaret joined him at the window. "The children will have a city different from the one you grew up in," she said. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the city only hides its corruption under new snow, waiting to thaw again." She smiled faintly. "Then they'll at least know which stains to look for." Later that evening, he walked to Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house. The old widow greeted him with trembling joy, having read about the verdict in every paper that week. "Horace would be proud," she said. "He never believed there could be justice through arithmetic. But perhaps numbers have the last word after all." They spoke a while of old times, of ledgers now turned to dust, of youth spent chasing precision through endless columns. When he left, the city lights seemed gentler. He walked home beneath gas lamps that burned brighter than he remembered, their reflections trembling in puddles left by melting snow. For the first time in years, he felt no shadow behind him, no sense of being followed, no dread of eyes watching from doorways. Only the hum of the streets and the faint scent of coal smoke rising like memory. Justice, he realized, could never balance the books entirely. There would always be lost entries, lives ruined, trust betrayed, loves eroded by fear. Yet tonight, the accounts stood closer to even than ever before. And for a man who had spent a lifetime among ledgers, that balance, however temporary, was enough. The year after the trials passed like a long exhalation. Newspapers moved on to new scandals, each louder than the last, until Hawthorne and his cohorts became footnotes in the story of the city's endless reinvention. Mentioned sometimes as cautionary figures, sometimes as relics, men who mistook the glitter of gold for the substance of virtue. For the bookkeeper, life resumed not as it had been, but as something quieter, steadier, stripped of illusion. He had accepted a modest appointment with the city's new oversight committee, a small team of auditors charged with reviewing municipal contracts and expenditures. There was irony in the task. Years spent unmasking fraud had made him the perfect man to prevent it. Yet this was no crusade. He worked methodically, finding satisfaction in the small honesty of balanced accounts, rather than the grand gestures of reform. Their new home stood on a street shaded by elms, a street where laundresses sang in the courtyards and neighbors greeted each other by name. The rent was modest, the rooms bright. Margaret arranged her sewing table near the window where light came strongest, and often in the afternoons, Anna and James played on the stoop, their laughter rising above the rattle of passing carts. The children had returned from Connecticut that spring, taller, sun-freckled, filled with stories of farm chores and friendly animals. Anna devoured books from the public library, eager and serious. Sometimes he caught her copying columns of numbers, inventing her own accounts for an imaginary enterprise, A. Ledger and Company. James preferred the river, spending hours throwing stones into water that accepted every one without complaint. Margaret seemed restful now. The years of fear had marked her, but her voice no longer trembled when strangers knocked. In the evenings, she read aloud or mended uniforms for city officers. Occasionally, she smiled in a way that made her look young again, the expression of a woman who had weathered storms and now savored stillness. From his office window on Chambers Street, he could see the harbor. Steamships arrived hourly where once only sails had filled the horizon. The city was changing faster than anyone could measure. Iron replacing brick, gas giving way to the first flickers of electric light, money flowing in quantities undreamed of when he was a boy on Mulberry Street. Yet beneath the transformation, he sensed the same heartbeat he had known all his life, the pulse of gain and loss, of human arithmetic that never stayed true for long. Each morning began with familiar rituals. Ink prepared, quills trimmed, columns ruled. Younger clerks came to him for advice. He taught them the same meticulous habits Mr. Pemberton once demanded, though with more kindness, more patience. "Every line tells a story," he told them. "If you write it carefully, you need never fear what others read." The apprentices nodded without understanding entirely, and he was content to let wisdom ripen in them at its own pace. William Shaw visited often, still carrying the air of a man whose curiosity outweighed his sense of self-preservation. His book about the scandal had found readers well beyond the city's borders, translated even into French newspapers, fascinated by American corruption. "I made little money," Shaw admitted cheerfully, "but plenty of enemies, which is far more satisfying." "How fares the city's most famous man of numbers?" "Unfamous again," the bookkeeper replied, handing him tea, "which suits me fine." Shaw stayed late that evening, the two of them watching dusk gather along the rooftops while discussing politics, literature, and the impossible hope that reform might outlast a single administration. When he finally left, his laughter echoed down the stairwell, friction against the solemn stability that had settled over the household like a protective charm. On Sundays, the family walked through the park uptown, where the broad avenues still smelled of new grass and horses. Anna carried a notebook everywhere, sketching carriages or scribbling sums for pleasure. James chased pigeons with relentless enthusiasm, his shouts mingling with church bells from distant spires. Sometimes the bookkeeper and Margaret sat on benches in comfortable silence, both thinking but saying little. He wondered often what had driven him all those years, the search for justice or something simpler. Perhaps the same instinct that compelled him as a boy to count everything he saw. Counting was a way to impose shape on the chaos of living, to turn the unmeasurable, loss, chance, love, into units he could almost comprehend. Yet now, surrounded by family and peace, he recognized that life itself never balanced cleanly. Its entries were emotional, not fiscal. Its profit lay in moments that left no record. At times he visited Mrs. Pemberton, frailer now, her mind prone to drifting between past and present. She mistook him once for her late husband and scolded him gently for working too late. He did not correct her. When he left, she pressed a worn coin into his hand. "A token of good accounting," she said. "Make sure the world keeps its books." He carried it afterward as a quiet talisman. Autumn returned, bringing crisp air and markets bursting with apples. City officials congratulated themselves on balanced budgets. Tillman moved into higher office, and the story of the gold scandal became history, mentioned only at bankers' dinners as a brief cloud in an otherwise golden decade. No one remembered the bookkeeper who had started it all, except the few who owed him their careers or their freedom. He neither sought recognition nor avoided it. Indifference had become his armor. One evening, as the lamps were being lit along the street, Anna approached his desk holding one of his old notebooks, one of the hidden copies he had kept sealed for years. "Papa, may I keep this?" He turned, startled. "Where did you find that?" "In the trunk with your coats. It's full of numbers, beautiful ones. I want to understand them." He considered, then nodded. "All right." But those accounts show what men are capable of, both honest and wicked. Then perhaps they show what I must choose between. She smiled that curious, solemn smile children wear when they echo truths beyond their years. Watching her, he felt both pride and unease. The world would tempt her, as it tempted everyone, to trade clarity for convenience. Yet part of him trusted she would see further than he had, with the advantage of his mistakes as her instruction. Later that night, when the children slept and Margaret had gone to bed, he sat alone by the fire. The house was quiet, except for the faint rattle of wind against the shutters. On the table lay an open ledger from his current work. City accounts, simple enough to reconcile without thought. He found himself adding a private note in its margin. Day's end, books balanced, family well, city restless but enduring. He closed the book, removed his spectacles, and listened. Beyond the window, the city's hum never ceased. Wheels, hooves, voices, each sound another entry in an account too vast to total. He wondered, not for the first time, if perhaps everyone kept two ledgers in life, one public, filled with necessity, and one hidden, where love, regret, and hope were recorded without currency. Margaret stirred in the next room, mumbling softly. The familiar sound comforted him. He rose, checked that the lamp wick burned low, and set the shutters against the chill. Outside, snowflakes had begun to fall quietly, softening the street's rough outlines. Somewhere in the darkness, a single church bell marked the hour. He watched the flakes spiral downward, touched by the same wonder that once came from columns of perfect numbers. The world still contained order, though not always the kind written in ink. He placed Mrs. Pemberton's coin beside the lamp and whispered into the half-dark, more thought than prayer. Every life must balance, one way or another. Then he sat again, opened a clean ledger, and began a new page, not for commerce, but for himself. At the top he wrote slowly, "Household accounts, blessings and debts." Beneath it, a list began forming without calculation. Margaret, patience. Anna, wisdom. James, laughter. Friends, loyalty. Years, hard-won peace. He paused, realized the totals could never truly be added, and smiled. Outside, snow continued its quiet descent, covering the city's noise and history alike. In that moment, the world felt briefly, impossibly balanced. And for a man who had spent a lifetime measuring loss and gain, that was enough.